the Kore is a figure who brings to the foreground this radical value of sovereignty and learning how to negotiate in our lives who we are as an authentic individual and do all of the dancing, that life requires of us.
Safron, it's really nice to have you on the podcast again. It's been a little
Mm,
while.
it has been. Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. I'm glad we could make this happen. You put out a book on the Kore archetype, and I think I had emailed you because I was coming up with some female clients of mine. They were talking about some struggles they were having in life and relationships, and these dream figures were coming to them, these young women, kind of like these strong, young, kind of sovereign, autonomous women. And I thought, "Ah, this sounds like what Saffron's talking about with the Corée,
Wow.
which was an archetype I was unfamiliar with. So anyway, I reached out and suggested that we do a podcast on it, and you sent me
Mhm.
the manuscript, which I think is based on your PhD dissertation at Pacifica, isn't it?
Partially, the last part of the book where I look at triad goddesses in Greek myth, that that was the focus of my doctoral dissertation. But everything on the Kore was the new material that I was writing, for the book.
Okay. So was it
Yeah.
your research into the triad goddesses that introduced you to the Corée? Like, when did she grab your attention?
Yeah, yeah. So, um, well, it's a little bit of a story, and so if you're down for the the
Oh yeah, we love
story,
stories here.
um, so I started working at Opus Archives and Research Center, which is the manuscript collections that are housed on the campuses of Pacifica Graduate Institute, when I was working on my doctoral dissertation. And I finished my doctoral dissertation, took a little bit of a break in terms of writing, and um, then a year or two later, I started to think, well, maybe I could turn parts of my dissertation into a book. That was happening while parallel, I was working in the archives, and I being there and having access to the materials that are there, I could open boxes and just see what was going on, see what was in the boxes. And for your listeners, if they're not familiar with Opus, at the time it had the manuscript collection of Joseph Campbell, the comparative mythologist, James Hillman, um, the archaeomythologist Marija Gimbutas, and among others who are important figures in depth psychology and mythology. But I came across a box um, in the Jane Hollister Wheelwright collection. And Jane Wheelwright was a Jungian analyst, and she had been in analysis with Jung. So this is like first generation. And she and her husband, Joe Wheelwright, had been co-founders of the San Francisco Jung Institute, which was the first Jung Institute in the US. So they were really important in terms of bringing Jung's ideas to the United States and all of that. So I'm in her box, one of her boxes, and I came across this transcript for a talk that she gave in the early 80s at the San Francisco Jung Institute, um, titled The Power of the Maiden. And I reference it in my book, even though it's an unpublished talk transcript. And as I'm reading Wheelwright's sort of exploration of the maiden archetype, basically, and linking it to Jung's ideas in his essay on the psychology of the core. um, I just became entranced with this figure, both the mythic figures that personify the maiden or core, the significance as Wheelwright was articulating that, and I suppose to sort of sum it up really briefly, what and this very much relates to how you shared that you have clients who are dreaming of these young, powerful, fierce, sovereign young women. Um, Jane Wheelwright was also tracking this in the dreams of her analysans. This is the early 80s. So we're in like full on second wave feminism. And she really was naming the potent place of this inner figure, this maiden virgin inner figure, and what it embodies, what it is symbolic of in terms of a woman's sense of wholeness, ultimate value, a sort of numinosity that, if we're thinking in Jungian terms, is related to the self as that inner sort of divine figure. So I became really interested in this. And then I realized that all of the triad goddesses that I had written about in my dissertation, they were all virgin goddesses. And all of a sudden I thought, whoa, this is really a totally unexpected motif. And so that started to lead me down the path of researching this figure, or researching the archetypal pattern, and then being able to draw it out in different ways.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you tell an anecdote in your book about Barbara Hanna.
Yes,
I think so. Was she at a lecture by that Jung was giving, and
right.
he was talking about these figures that showed up in female Analysan's dreams, and he said, "What?" He was pondering, like, what could this female figure be? And she shouted out, "The self." Is that right?
I know. Yeah. I mean, so when I came across that anecdote, um, in the midst of doing my research on the core, I was like, yeah, Hannah was onto something, even though in the stream of what Jung was trying to draw out, it didn't quite seem to be aligning. So it's an interesting moment of a little bit of a interpretive conflict. But yes, yes, this and I think that that's a really interesting point, which is that when you look at some of these first generation Jungians, like Jane Wheelwright, Barbara Hanna, and then also um, Irene Claremont de Castillejo, who I talk about in the book, they already in the early days of the sort of development of Jungian psychology were already questioning Jung's contrasexual notion that because for men, they're the as Jung put forward, for men the innermost soul figure is feminine. That's the anima, that Latin word for soul, um, which Jung has explored in an extraordinary degree as well as others. But he theorized that because it's a contrasexual image, that the same would be true for women, that their innermost soul figure would be masculine. Now, while the animus is a very important inner figure in a woman's psyche, what Wheelwright and Hannah and Claremont de Castillejo were already beginning to articulate was, wait a minute, I'm not so sure. not only in their own personal experiences, but from what they were gathering in their analysans, dreams, and active imaginations, that it was as if that that inner figure that represents the self as the central kind of God image. So that's in a kind of personified mythic form, but in a more psychological, theoretical way, it would be the center of the whole psyche around which the unconscious and consciousness is constellated, and which is fundamental to a sense of wholeness, which individuation drives one to. Um, that that it's actually a female figure. So this was something that was already getting sort of wrestled with from the very beginning of Jungian psychology. And yet, see, this was also what struck me. And yet, it's like that doesn't really kind of rise to the surface in Jungian psychology. Like, we don't hear about that a lot, you know. Um, at least, yeah, I mean, it's not front and center in some way, which I think is interesting.
Hmm.
So
Like we don't hear about a kind of pushback on Jung's notion that the self shows up as a contrasexual figure. Is that what you mean?
or more perhaps simply that perhaps women's innermost self figure is feminine, and I use that just to push the valence on the archetypal dimension, not the sort of biological or gender notion, but that there's at the heart of it is a feminine figure rather than a masculine figure.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, like, why do you think, because we have these prominent female Jungians, first generation, who are putting forth this kind of alternate take on it. Why do you think that wasn't really picked up in subsequent years?
I don't know. I don't know. I think I
It's like,
I mean,
is
just
it like the
yeah,
fundamentalism of a lot of Jungians who are just like, well, this is what Jung found and this is the way it is?
perhaps that might be part of it. I think also the whole notion of the union of opposites is
Mm,
so profoundly important in Jungian psychology. And of course, that sort of male, female, and that whole dance of opposites, there there's a lot of psychic truth about it, and perhaps that has um, been part of it. But I think there,
hmm
but that said, I mean, I think that there are um, some people who have put it forward, but perhaps with not so sharp of a statement like Claremont de Castillejo did. For example, I mean, I think Marion Woodman, the extraordinary Jungian analyst and body soul, um,
And
uh,
Canadian.
and a Canadian. That's
We'll claim
right.
her, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Virgin is obviously central in all of her writing, and I think that it wouldn't be stretching um, her own, our own interpretation of how she might have phrased it, which is that really is a self figure for women in their own emergence. But I mean, Marion even extended it to say, and I love this about her work, that she saw the virgin archetype as being necessary for women and men, that sense of an inviolable place in our psychic being, a place of
Mm,
um, um, purity, and not in a rigid sense, but
hmm
purity in the sense of being in touch with the source of our depths, the truth of our emotional reality, that we all need a relationship to that, and that's what the Kore Virgin personifies. And so Marian, really, she didn't sort of claim the Virgin just for women, but in fact, all people, all individuals suffer when they do not have a relationship to that dimension of their being.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's kind of a good detail to draw out that not virginal in the sense of some notion of purity, but some aspect of ourself that is impenetrable, uncorruptible,
Right.
whole. I think one of the terms he uses is something like whole unto itself.
Right. Right. Yeah, because and this comes from another first generation Jungian, Esther Harding, who translated the Greek word parthenos, which is in its own way quite synonymous with kore, but parthenos is the root from which we get the word parthenogenetic, like to give birth from oneself. And so, which apparently seahorses do, I think. But Esther Harding translates parthenos to mean undivided, and then we can kind of amplify that more metaphorically and psychologically, that the Virgin um, um, personifies that state of being where one is undivided from oneself or unto oneself. And I also talk about that as um, I think being really close to when we talk about being in integrity with oneself, that there's an integral um, connection to what our reality and truth is. And that's another way to be undivided, that our the way we are in relationships, the way we step into the world, our persona, that those are not, you know, sort of islands unto themselves from our sense of who we are, that they're all connected in some really fundamental way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting because I was getting kind of hung up on the description of the Corée as virgin, and I was
Mm,
thinking, well, if she's a personification of the self being a symbol of wholeness, well,
mm-hmm,
then the virginal is only one aspect of who we can be. What about the sexual part? What about motherhood, fatherhood? Uh,
mm-hmm.
those seem to be left out when we speak of a virgin, but what I hear you saying is that virgin goes beyond the sexual act, that it has more to do with the integrity, the kind of the completeness, wholeness.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, right. And see, I think this is where, um, there are kind of these levels where we can talk about the roles that we fulfill in our life, like being a mother or a father or a lover or creator. And then these archetypal patterns, which the goddesses and gods personify, that we don't literally live out. So, like, one does not have to literally abstain from intimacy and sexuality in order to be in relationship to the Corey Virgin archetype. I think that it's just as you were saying, that we're listening to it as a metaphor, and Corey Virgin as a metaphor describes a state of being where, um, in the midst of whatever our in the world um, identities we have and roles that we are not separated from our sort of virginal essence of who we are. I think there's that piece.
Mm.
Um, there's also a sense of um, um, a sense of belonging to ourselves that doesn't get um, that we don't abdicate, like we don't abdicate in because of the demands that the world makes on us. There's that piece.
Mhm.
And um, and there's another piece too, which I think is related to um, a sense of uh, well, authority in our lives, and but not just in an ego-driven sense, but if the Kore Virgin uh, is an image of the self, the deeper wholeness that we are, how are we in relationship to that? How are we, and I mean, this is the task of a lifetime, to be in relationship to the self as the um, sort of inner figure and pattern that moves us toward our telos, or our kind of creative unfolding into life. How do we learn to listen to what is authentic to that, and then move that out into our life in some fuller way? And so authorship, or that authority that I often talk about in terms of the Kore, is not just sort of ego driven, but I think it's also it's more so about where that's sourced in that deeper sense of being.
Hmm. Yeah, a phrase just came to my mind. There's the ego-driven, but there is also action that is self-driven, capital S
Mm,
self-driven. Um, I like what you quoted Esther Harding here. She said, "The woman who is psychologically virgin, again, there's that distinction, not taking it literally, but
right.
psychologically virgin, capital V, so archetypal virgin, is one in herself and does what she does not because of any desire to please, not to be liked, or to be approved, even by herself, not
Mm-hmm.
because of any desire to gain power over another, but because what she does is true."
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a beautiful choice of words there, like true in its original sense, meant to be
Mm,
in alignment, right?
mm-hmm.
So true,
Mm,
so the ego in alignment with self.
mm-hmm.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
beautiful.
I know that, and I'm so glad that you captured that, because when I first, maybe like the first 20 times, it felt like that I read that sentence. I'm like, what is she talking about? This not even to please herself. And it took me a while to realize that Harding was differentiating between our ego ambitions and desires, and sensibilities, and the deeper self. And one who is in touch with the self, we learn slowly the differentiation between what is coming from the depths, so to speak, what the impetus that's coming from the depths, and how that then has to be translated into the actions, and decisions that we're making in our life. And sometimes what the self wants
Mhm.
is not very convenient for what we would like, or what we've committed ourselves to, or what we said we would do. And that, wow, I mean,
Mm.
that's the that's the alchemical work there, isn't it? um
Yeah.
so yeah, I just think Harding's expression of that is so, um my coming to understand that took time, and I'm so grateful that I took my time to get that. But yes, I think that the core, yes, that whole sensibility of what it is to be psychologically virgin puts us in touch with the self. And in a way, that does shine a light on a little bit of a paradox, doesn't it? Because on the one hand, in that passage of Harding's, when we are in touch, when we are in touch with that, sort of living in relationship to Korehood, as I call it, on the one hand, we are really contained within the sense of what's true, as you drew out, And at the same time, we are opening ourselves up to the wisdom and intelligence of the depths. And that's an interesting paradox. We are both unto oneself and yet open. And I think that's something that I think I really love. And perhaps and I think this is where another sort of stream that belongs to the larger riverbed that we might say is the archetypal river of the Virgin archetype, that speaks to the pregnant virgin, these figures who are both virgin but also have been opened to and receptive to receiving some divine seed or moisture or fire, however it shows up in the mythology. And in being open, receptive, something is seeded and then will be born that is, of extraordinary
Consequence,
sacred,
or
yeah,
yeah.
consequence, value, totally world altering,
Hmm.
baby. Yeah. Metaphorically
Yeah.
speaking.
I mean, yeah, I think you've touched on some really important things that I just want to linger over. Hey, I want to take a moment to speak with you about this channel. Currently, only 11% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. I think those numbers are terrible. So if you're enjoying this content and you want to help out the channel, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can become a member of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon, which will give you access to early release of full ad-free episodes, plus access to the archive of the first 100 episodes of this podcast. It would really help me out and allow me to keep creating content like the interview that you're watching right now. Okay, thanks so much. Now, back to the interview. Um, what
Yeah.
came to mind is this equation I sometimes bring into client sessions where, let's just say, sometimes we have to choose between authenticity and attachment. And
Mm,
so if we're fulfilling Korehood or in connection with this Kore potential or power, then we're maybe more apt to value authenticity over attachment. So sometimes we have to give up our authenticity in order to maintain attachment. Like you're saying,
right.
like the persona is compartmentalized, or it's not a
Right.
reflection of our whole self or our true self.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult decision to make sometimes because we maybe have been conditioned to rely so much on attachment, acceptance, evaluation from others, all that kind of
Yeah.
thing. So I think that's pointing to that well, when you look at those figures of the Kore, the marble statues, there is a real upright
Hmm.
strength, kind of stoic quality to these figures. And so I think it's
Yes,
pointing to that strength that's
that's right.
required to be true to oneself.
Yes, I think that's a really great sort of working with the feeling that the especially the archaic Greek Kore statues evoke. Yes, the strength that's required to be grounded in our sense of individuality or authenticity. Um, None of the archaic Kore statues are ever sitting or lying down. They are always standing in that incredibly upright and sort of sheathed posture. And I think that points to something of the vitality and perhaps even the kind of ferocity of that core energy that says, I stand here. But as you so well say, based on our lived, the complexity of our lived experience, this core need can come into conflict with other equally valid needs in our life, like attachment and, relational um, connection and our social, participation. These archetypal energies of the psyche uh, collide, and they can, that's what all of the challenge, all these, so many myths, they depict these complicated and difficult scenes, in essence, depicting the complicated and difficult collisions between these different instinctual dimensions of our nature.
Mm. Hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
for example, with just to draw that out for a
Hmm.
moment, in the Greek tradition, which is the one that I'm grounded in, that it's my area of specialty, but there are Kore virgin goddesses in many different mythologies, but Artemis is one of the great virgin goddesses in the Greek pantheon, and we continually see her um, stories where the privacy of her bathing in her sacred grove is transgressed, usually by someone who doesn't mean to do it, but
Yeah,
it
they stumble
happens.
upon her and disturb
Right,
her.
like Actaeon. Yes, right. And so that shows the unfortunate meeting between that Kore virgin landscape and something else. It might be the wandering puer. It might be the hero. It might be the lover. I
The
mean,
hunter. Hmm.
the hunter. Yes, there are lots of, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
And that's great. Like, because, yeah, we can have this idealistic vision of like being in my hood, or like for me,
mm,
the in my hermitude. And, um,
mm,
but then you either need to engage with the outer world and society, or society kind of invades your
right.
your kind of isolated sacred space and disrupts things and challenges you. But it reminds me of how,
Yeah.
like, when you're talking about the self, and like the telos of the self is toward wholeness and individuation. Well, of course, that's going to be at odds with the ego, and
Mm,
that's just natural. And like, so the self is always going to be asking things of us that require us to stretch our boundaries and to
mm,
make ourselves larger, to increase our capacities and all of
mhm.
that. And so that's another one of the challenges when we've like, when we really feel something like on an instinctual level, like, this is something that I need to do, but oh my God, like putting
Mhm.
myself out there, I'll be vulnerable to judgment and attack, or like, what if I fail at this thing? And
Right.
so we run into all of these, the problems of the ego, who wants like just the kind of security and maintain the status quo, and like, let's not rock the boat. And yet there are
Mhm.
these drives within us to push beyond those boundaries.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And I think that the core is a really radical, is a figure who um, sort of brings to the foreground this radical value of sovereignty, and learning how to negotiate in our lives who we are as an authentic individual, and do all of the dancing, that life requires of us. But see, I think this is a point that um, Jane Wheelwright makes in her piece, which is that one of the reasons she saw the virgin maiden, those were the words she used, or terms she used, as um, a more um, that the psyche, that the deep unconscious was putting forward through individual experiences, but also these collective values that were really evident in the 70s and 80s, um, regarding women's liberation and second wave feminism and all that. Is she said that the Virgin Maiden offers a more complete psychic image because than the mother, because the Virgin, when you look at the myths of virgin goddesses, they are both unto themselves and sovereign, and also have all these other roles, like virgin goddesses who are lovers, virgin goddesses who are sisters and warriors. Some of them are even mothers. That it's as if something of that virgin archetypal core doesn't get eroded or
Mm,
um, it's the central, like, it's the central nodal point
hmm.
that when we are in touch with it, we can be and move into all these different dimensions of life experience,
Right.
but coming out of or maintaining a connection to something of our core individuality. So I realize I just
Hmm.
sort of slipped into the psychological side, but this shows up mythically. And so, Wheelwright said
Hmm.
that this is why she's such a powerful figure in the inner world, because it's not one or the other. The
Hmm.
the the Virgin Maiden has and I write about this multiplicity, like she has a multivalent nature
Hmm.
that can unfurl and a million ribbons of expression, but they're all connected to and sourced in something really essential and individual.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great point. So, um, the virgin aspect doesn't get transformed when one becomes a mother or a
Right.
lover. It retains itself, and it's like we can add layers to it or other nodes, other facets, but that remains unchanged. Um,
Hmm.
that's great. So it adds complexity, it adds multiplicity, which I think is the way we are, the way things are. So I like
Right.
that it's not this easy, like, well, that old triptych of the maiden, mother, crone. It's like their phases. You transform from one into
Right.
the other.
Right.
No, it's like the Matryoshka doll. It's like you add
Yeah.
another layer around that core, which is never lost.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. And I mean, as you work with people, and as you were sharing about the kind of conflict that you see between autonomy and attachment, I mean, isn't part of what you are working with people around is they're learning to not identify with their particular roles that they inhabit or relational dynamics that they're in, but to be able to see that as a part of who they are, but to not identify with being the mother. Like, see, and that's something, and that's exactly it. So going back to the Matryoshka doll, it's that we can be in or put on the garb of this relationship or this deeply important way in which I inhabit my life. But at the end of the day, in a kind of metaphorical way speaking, we know how to come back to the well of our central being and be refilled by that, not lose ourselves in being the mother or being the lover. That there's a really creative inner tension that stays alive.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm just kind of going to practically how to live that out. And so what I'm imagining is, a woman who's a mother, maybe she works and so she's got to play another role in the workplace as like teacher or whatever. But then I think it might be important for her to have a place that she can come back to, kind of like Artemis her little grove or her little spring where she can come back to at the end of the day or at the
Mm,
beginning of the day and connect with who she is at her core before putting on the garb or after taking the garb off. I mean,
right.
what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's totally right on. Um, I think that's actually one of I think that's what a journal is for many people.
Hmm.
So it might not be a physical place per se that someone feels that they're like literally, sitting at the well, whatever that might be. But a journal as being a place where we can speak truly, we can articulate how it is that we feel, what it is that belongs to us, what it is that we're longing for. You see, I think that's how we stay in touch with our core nature, which is how we are able to really make room for our inner feeling reality. So a journal can do that, but people have all sorts of different practices, I think, that help them get into rhythm with get them back in touch with their own core rhythm, which is always going to be profoundly unique.
Hmm.
But I think this is as important. I think this is as important for men as it is for women.
Hmm.
Men too, right? The roles and responsibilities and sociocultural pressures and expectations. What what is one's inner sense of who they are and what deeply matters? Um, how is that attended to? How does one stay close to that in relationship to everything else? I mean, I think this is a fundamental human question, you
Hmm.
know.
Yeah, I was talking to a male client just the other day about this, and he was running into a lot of difficulty in making decisions because every time there was an opportunity to do something, it was like this whole menu of options would open out in front of him, and
Mm,
out of each one of those options, it was like a kind of tree of consequence and the evaluation of like, is this going to be optimal for my career
mm,
or optimal for my self-development? But there's always this kind of like program of optimization running on top of all of these decisions that all these
mm,
choices he could make. What I was
right.
trying to point him to was just like, what what does your heart or what does your gut lead you to before you can kind of run the program and assess which one is going to be best for my business or my learning or my self-improvement program. It's just like, what is that like inner desire pointing you toward, and kind of experiment with just following that and see where it leads
Mm,
you. I think this
mm,
is kind of what you're talking about, right? So the way to reconnect with oneself could be something like a journal practice, but it could also be allowing yourself to make a decision based on just some kind of like instinct or intuition
mm,
or inner desire. Uh, you know, what am I going to do? I don't know. I just feel like I want to take a bath. And so the bath is
right.
you expressing your sovereignty, your autonomy, something like
Right.
that, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. And, I think another level of it too would be being able to differentiate between what the collective values and what
Yeah.
it is that I value. Because when I hear like optimization,
Mm-hmm.
I just can't help but feel like that is whispering um, an outer, almost like super ego that's saying, "What's the best thing that you can do here that's going to have the most, return on investment?"
Yeah, exactly.
uh,
And
yeah,
that's like kind
right,
of part of the capitalist programming. Like
right,
everything we do has to pay off in some way. And that a
right.
lot of that is justified because it can be really difficult to make it in this world, especially in North
Yes,
America at the moment. And so
yes.
totally understandable, but I think we need to make
Yes.
space for doing something for its own sake, right?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I also think that the core is predominantly inward facing rather than
Mm,
outward facing. And I explored that a bit in the book when I talked about how um, in the U.S. Western, our kind of Western paradigm of culture, that there is such a strong emphasis on being extroverted. And that's another way to talk about, I think, what you're saying, which is what am I doing that's contributing to my success and my security, and that is going to be generative and supportive of me. And that all in our culture has a very extroverted, outward facing in the world. That's where it's happening
mhm,
because of our capitalistic model, of course. Um, and the core stands as a really interesting um, counterweight, I think, to that collective pressure.
mm,
Because her interiority, see, that would be another way to think about virginity as actually describing interiority, an inner space, an innerness that somehow remains untouched or unaccessed. And
mhm,
it's in our interiority that, just as you were describing with this particular client of yours, that the intuitive spark or the gut feeling or the emotional sort of hit around something, that's where it registers.
mm,
it's
mhm,
in it's in our inner world, our interiority. And so the core, I think, in that sense, this, what she represents, the sort of gravitas of the direction that she personifies, is an incredibly important counterweight to the what it is that we navigate, living in the world that we live in.
mhm. Yeah, I pulled a quote from your book. You say, "It is the function of the core to safeguard us from losing ourselves to collective forces by turning us
Mm,
inward."
mm,
I mean, that
right.
it just feels like a strong statement there, like, and thinking about those figures again, that kind, like, there is almost a kind of what's the word I'm thinking of? Like a guardianship, like with that
Mm,
upright stature. I can see her maybe like in front of a pillar or almost acting as a pillar with their
right.
one hand raised in this gesture that feels to me like it's a gesture of alignment to the
Mm,
core, to the spinal column, to the backbone, something like
yes.
that.
Yeah, yeah, I love those archaic figures. Some of them have their hands like up either by their heart or often by the solar plexus.
Hmm.
And like they might be holding a bird or an apple or a pomegranate. And it's
Hmm.
as if what I hear when I see that posture is as if she says, I'm weighted here.
Mm-hmm.
Just the sense of yeah, that profound um gravity of alignment, the strength of the spinal column, the structural integrity of one's inner knowing. And just to make a little bit of an amplification, um, into my astrological world, I connect the core to the astrological Saturn. That that
Hmm.
that she um, is a, let's say, redemptive feminine face of the whole Saturnian
Hmm.
process, um, and labor that perhaps our Saturn labors of constraint and responsibility and limitation are ways in which we come into relationship with our chorehood. And so that's
Mm,
something that I've been exploring in my astrological discipline. But I just bring that out because you're returning to the sort of phenomenological impact of those statues. What you're expressing, I see as belonging to how we would talk about Saturn. You
mm,
know, the structural integrity, the weightiness, the strength to stand, and the stoicism. I mean, these are all very Saturn words, aren't they?
yeah, right.
Saturn gifts.
Hmm. Yeah, so that's interesting. So are you seeing like the aspects of Saturn as being necessary for the core to exist or for you to be in touch with that
I
energy?
well, I well, I think I would say that maybe we could say that Saturn is a threshold guardian to chorehood. That the
Mm-hmm.
issues that belong to Saturn, as we would talk about them in an astrological chart, those issues are the very ways that we come into touch with our chorehood. So I'm saying this
Mm,
because these values that belong to the core, sovereignty, containment, gravitas, um, being in touch with our core sense of self, the truth of the matter is that we come into relationship with these dimensions of our being, usually because they have been denied us, or somehow they've been wounded, or we've had
mm-hmm.
great difficulty feeling that. See, I think on one level, there's an enormous idealization of the Kore Virgin, um,
Mm-hmm.
which belongs to the numinosity of the archetypal figures. You know, we can idealize the mother, we can idealize, you know, the good father. You know, I mean, it happens when we're in touch with these archetypal figures and the realities that they're describing. But
Mm-hmm.
but particularly with the Kore Virgin, the idealization of the youthfulness and the purity and being unsullied and like un you know un mishandled.
Right,
but the, but
uncorrupted.
but but that's the archetypal image, the lived experience of how we come into relationship to those values is actually
Mm-hmm.
through the wound, through the lack, through having once had it. See, I think for many people, they can get a hit of this in their own personal experience when they think back on having been young, when they connect to youthful places of the imagination and memory. But we've all had experiences where that became misshapen or educated out of us, or you know, whatever, politely you know, left behind, whatever, you know, however we might describe it. And then for some people there's been great trauma around, again, this sense of core self, and a sense of who they are, and their feeling reality. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying all
I
of
gotcha.
that yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I get really passionate about that piece. Sorry.
I know, and I get it. No, but it's great. And thanks for kind of like helping me to see where you're coming from with that. So, uh, the way I'm understanding it is, so the kind of negative aspects of Saturn, like let's say the oppression,
Mm,
that almost needs to happen first before we realize what's been lost, in order to go on that journey of reclamation of that aspect of ourselves that something
right.
like that.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. So
Like
so
it's
the
the wound, like
oppression.
someone said once, sorry, just that the
Mhm, mhm,
wound
yeah.
is like the doorway to the gift.
Exactly.
something like that.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So if we're talking about astrological Saturn, and to use the term oppression as you did, if we can often experience that as those people or institutions that have authority over us. It's only in first experiencing what it is to be under something or someone else's authority that we come into the quest of learning what it is to be our own authority,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Only when our autonomy is denied us do we come into and fight for and discover what it is to be to actually stand in our own autonomy. So
Hmm.
yeah, that would be the that's the that's the kind of uh, to use Hillman's term of like pathologizing, that where there's the psyche, there's suffering is fundamental to the psyche, that woundedness belongs to the nature of the way the psyche moves. On the one hand, that's that sort of Saturn dimension, but through that, something of enormous value can be born because of that,
Hmm. Right. Yeah.
not
It's,
in spite of it.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's like the idea that suffering wakes us up, and so if you actually wake up due to the suffering getting bad enough, that will lead you into kind of a new territory,
Mm,
and so there's a gift in there too. Like
right.
my my yoga teacher would say, "Thank God for my suffering because it led me to yoga." Like it
Right.
was because of the suffering that he sought out a path toward freedom.
Right.
And so there's like a loss of innocence there. And so
Yes.
like the Kore isn't like that idealized version of the maiden who's like untouched and pure and innocent, but there's like you said, there's a gravitas to her. So there is something there about a reclamation, about um, yeah, it's not yeah, I I think I'm grasping it.
Well, I think, yeah, no, 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 you're totally there. I see. I think it's about the way we are move into a process of reclamation or being in relationship to the core through the suffering.
Hmm.
That she's always there as the ideal, and it's about how we are connected to that, or how we discover the pathways that lead us to being in touch with those values that
Hmm.
she personifies. Mm-hmm.
And I think that speaks to like what you were saying earlier about this archetype arising during the 60s and second wave feminism, which
Mm,
was a time of reclamation of female power and status in a patriarchal society.
right,
And so this totally jibes like on the personal and the societal or collective level.
right, right. So yeah, so we would say that the there was the in the collective unconscious, this archetype was constellating and it was being expressed collectively in all these various ways, and being encountered individually, um, and yeah, it's pretty uh, amazing to think about that because because it, I think this is an illustration of one of the ideas of Jung's, which is that archetypes don't die, but they can um, sort of recede into the depths of the
Hmm.
unconscious, because there's just no it's just not constellated at a particular time, meaning it's
Hmm.
not it's not living in an active way for a culture. But then, for one reason or another, who knows, it begins to move and it begins to rise up.
Hmm.
Um, So, and I think that somewhat of a parallel to this, I mean, it happened earlier than in the 80s, but when, and Jung writes about this, which is in the Catholic Church, Mary's ascension and
Right.
like the recognition. I mean, that was pretty radical in the sort of 2000-year history of the Christian mythos and the denigration and repression of the feminine dimension,
Hmm.
right? And so that would I would see that as one of the nodal points of this larger constellation.
Yeah, and maybe a precursor to, because I think that was in the late 40s that that happened.
Uh-huh.
And so that maybe even as like a kind of an echo from the past of what was to come with the whole women's
Mm,
lib movement in the 60s and
mm,
70s.
right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Now, I want to talk about the shadow side of this
Yeah.
archetype,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I need a little 1 minute break. Hey, I want to take a moment to speak with you about this channel. Currently, only 11% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. I think those numbers are terrible. So, if you're enjoying this content and you want to help out the channel, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can become a member of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon, which will give you access to early release of full ad-free episodes, plus access to the archive of the first 100 episodes of this podcast. It would really help me out and allow me to keep creating content like the interview that you're watching right now. Okay, thanks so much. Now, back to the interview. I was thinking like what tarot card would represent the Kore, and I immediately kind of thought of the Star card.
Mm,
This naked woman by a stream, kind of whole into herself. She always gives me that vibe. It's like she doesn't need anything. She's good. Like she's in her true nature, you know?
mm.
And so I was gonna pull it out of my deck here, and I can't find her. I don't know where she went. And I'm kind of confounded by that, that she should kind of come up and be absent. And maybe that's kind of like a Corey thing, that she's off somewhere
Well,
else.
well, yes, but also perhaps the kind of invisibility of the Kore. There's something about her that um, defies being drawn out, you know. Wow, that's such an interesting kind of synchronicity.
I know it does feel like that. Um, yeah. Okay, I'll look for her later. But I did
Okay.
want to talk about, I think like, okay, so there's a lot of interest in archetypes. And I think what I see sometimes is that when people identify with one single archetype, it can be a kind of avoidance or defense against things that they don't want to face or work on. Um, do you think like, the Korea can be a very attractive figure, especially in this day and age, in kind of post-patriarchal paradigm, let's say? Uh, she can really stand out as an aspirational image
Mm,
for women in particular.
mhm.
Now, do you think there's a danger if one is to overly identify with her that it could be acting as a way to avoid or defend against dealing with like relational issues or somehow, playing well with society and that
Right.
kind of thing?
Wow, that's such a great question, Brian. And there are two things I'd like to say. The first, in a more kind of general point, with your opening up how there is such an interest in archetypes. It's so much more a part of the general conversation. Um, and what you said about people identifying. So I just wanted to make a comment in a general point on that, because this is so critical, which is that one of the great dangers, psychologically speaking, is when people identify with any one or another archetype, because identification is what in more religious ritual language we would call possession. And the whole work of consciousness would be being able to discern and differentiate who I am as a very limited human person from these powerful archetypal patterns and energies that I come in and out of connection and relationship to. And I just wanted to say that because I think that that's the whole part of like the Jungian psychological background that's gotten lost with
Hmm.
the popularization, let's say, of talking about archetypes and who we are. Like it's not about finding our archetype. It's about learning how to dance with these deep patterns of nature that are universal and which flow through us and shape our experience and our perceptions. But we are human
Hmm.
and very, very limited, and goodness, we need to be very humble when we are in touch with these powerful dimensions of experience. So,
Yeah.
having said that, and maybe just a really, for your listeners, like a really kind of prosaic example of this is, you know, to, for someone, to step into the archetypal role of being a teacher. You step into the classroom, you're writing to your students, you're giving a presentation. To identify with the teacher would mean to not have any room for making a mistake, for not knowing something or an answer, to be godlike. And that, there's something about being able to wear the mantle, but to fully know we're wearing the mantle.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Consciousness. Yeah.
totally. Consciousness of our ego, our ego self, which we need because it's what guards us from being blown out by these identifications.
Mm.
So, yeah. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I'm just reminded of like what Jung said about the function of religion as being a defense against these numinous powers and against
Totally,
possession and over-identification, right? And
totally.
and so in like a post-religious age, uh, where it's kind of like all up for grabs, and every day I see something go by on social media that says, "Find your archetype." What's your archetype quiz? I'm like, oh
Right.
no.
No. No, right. And the suffering that comes with that lack of differentiation, think about, the person that profoundly identifies with being the mother, and the way they can then be, they feel and believe they have to be available to everyone all the
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, there's the cost
Eh,
of their own relationship to the core, their a sense of identity differentiated from being available and nurturing and kind, and however, we might unpack that.
yeah, I mean, something that I see come up quite a bit with clients who are maybe have young children is that the mother takes on that role, embodies that archetype because she wants so much to be a good mother that she neglects all those other aspects of herself. And then even the
Right,
partner projecting mother onto her and not being able to see her as lover anymore. And so
right,
they lose the kind of the sexual spark in their relationship. And so I'm always trying to help those kind of clients differentiate and say, look,
right,
she can be mother, but in the bedroom, like, can you allow her to be lover,
right.
to be sexy again and all of that. Yeah, really important point.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay, and then so coming out of that, you were asking
Hmm.
about, like the sort of shadow aspects of the core.
Hmm.
Yeah, well, and that's another really important piece. in terms of archetypal theory, which is that the archetypes are bivalent. I mean, they're multivalent, but but there is a kind of bivalence about them, which is that they have both their sort of life giving, but
Mhm.
also sort of death giving faces, so to speak, like where they are
Right, serving
generative.
life or serving death. Yeah.
Right, where
Mhm.
they are generative or where they can become kind of
Destructive.
restrictive.
Yeah.
So, like thinking about the mother, so the life affirming face of the mother is the one that gives, that creates life and can nurture life. But then, of course, there's the devouring mother, and we see that
We
Demeter
see
in
that
Greek
we
myth.
see that everywhere in culture
We
at the
see,
moment.
totally there, of course, absolutely, because it's an archetypal reality. And the mythic figures show us the very real potential for that flip. Think about Demeter, who is the mother goddess of the grain, who, when her daughter is taken from her, she sends a blight on all of the crops and refuses anything to grow, and all of humanity is starving.
Hmm.
So mother has
The
that.
spiteful mother. Yeah.
Yes, mother has that power. So with the core,
Hey, my
there's,
mother used to say
yeah.
that I gave you life and I can take it away. She was channeling Demeter. All this time, I had no idea. You ever hear that
Well,
one?
that's great. So true, so real, so powerful. Yeah. Um, so
Sorry to
yeah, I
put you
mean,
off track there.
no, not at all, not at all. The shadow side of the core, if on the one hand the generative would be about that sense of connection to core self, um, she's also the eternally youthful one. So there's a vitality, a kind of spark and freshness that belongs to the core, a sense of um, being open to what might be emergent. So those would be a couple of generative sides of the core, because that's what youthfulness symbolizes. It's possibility. It's
Mhm.
what may emerge, and core goddesses are always young, um,
Pregnant with possibility.
pregnant with possibility. So I think the shadow side of the core is um, being closed off,
Hmm.
and that closed off does not allow for the spark of the new, right? um, Being cold. See, I think that that's another really evident shadow side of the core. It's the cold one that cannot be touched.
Hmm.
No feeling, no interest, no spark, just so aloof and untouchable. And and because of that, it seems um, it barren,
Hmm.
like life can't take seed in her at all.
Well, yeah,
Yeah,
because the door is closed.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, perhaps we would
Uh-huh.
say psychological. So, if those are more sort of poetic images, psychologically, that could be someone that could come through perhaps in the ways in which we're really defended from any person's point of view. Like,
Hmm.
I'm just this, I've
Oh,
always thought like
when we
you do
say
you feels like a cold. Oh, was that where you were going?
no, but something related. Yeah, you do you or my
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah, exactly. It's very that kind of has to me, that's like Athena with her breastplate. Like, I am
Hmm.
so not at all available, and here's my uh I am well defended and appointed to stand behind um the weight of what I see as my truth. And that's yeah. So I think
Hmm.
that is a very important aspect of the core.
Yeah, I've never thought about that detail of Athena having the breastplate. and that being significant that it's not full body armor, it's a breastplate. And so the
Yeah.
breast being a place of nurturance, being the soft front body where, when we hug, that's where we connect.
Yes.
When the
Yes.
when pregnant, the belly needs to expand.
Right.
So
Right.
that constraining all of that, wow, powerful.
But and that breastplate, as an image, it can be used to protect what is vulnerable
Right.
when we need. I mean, so that's the other thing, that the Kore's
The two
capacity
sides.
to set up the tower, the boundary, and say, "Thou shalt not pass," that can be absolutely critical for someone to protect who they are, their sensibility. But that same function can be used to defend one against life.
Hmm.
And yeah,
Or the implement of protection can also be constraining and restricting to oneself.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. That we can, that where life is leading us at some points actually demands us to move into relationship to a different dimension of our nature, which would mean letting go of certain prominent attitudes or sensibilities because they've become restrictive to the unfolding vitality of our life and our psychic becoming, for sure.
Mm. Hmm. Um, I'm just noticing the time. Now, there's a couple places where I would like to go before we close, and I'm
Okay.
not sure we can get them both in. So, one thing that I wanted to talk to you about is what you see as some of the barriers
Right.
to connecting with the core A. And also, because you write about it so passionately, I need to ask you about the shoes.
Oh.
So I don't know what you think we have time for here, but I'll leave it up to
Yeah,
you. Where do you
well,
want to go?
maybe I can just say a little bit on each, just to, you know, uh, put in, yeah. So let's start with the barriers. Well, we talked a little bit about it earlier, I think, which was the sort of cultural extroversion and the challenges of our particular
Hmm.
period in
Like
the
the
West.
demands of the
Outer
society.
world. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. And to what it is to be visible all the time. Like, produce. So whether one is on social media or not, I am very much not. That might be one way that we might talk about visibility. But another way that I think that it shows up is the cultural extroversion in our sense of having to constantly be productive,
Hmm.
to produce, to demonstrate our being by constantly doing.
Hmm.
And that is another kind of extroversion. And and when and if that is where our energy goes all the time, I need to be making, I need to be creating, I need to be checking off my to-do list, I need whatever our doing looks like, and the way that that's serving outside us,
Hmm.
that whole orientation and draw of our energy and time can be a barrier to coming into relationship with the core, which I don't think is very much interested in how successful or productive or driven or how much we're slaying it outside, because the core would be related to, at its depth, um, our relationship to our core self,
Yeah.
and what are the needs that are true, which may have very little to do with what takes up the lion's share of our day.
Yeah, I was going to mention that earlier when we were talking about the kind of the demands of the soul or the self on the ego or the person, right? I could ask you to do things that are really in conflict with or challenging to your kind of beliefs or your way of being in the world, your roles, all that stuff. But it's like something that's become really apparent to me is the archetypes, because they are divine powers, they don't give a damn about your mundane life. And if you run the risk of becoming possessed by an archetype, it's going to run you into the ground
Right.
because it's
Right.
beyond
It's
ideas of
inhuman.
like your lifetime, and
Yeah.
and so it'll just it'll run you out. And you see that with people, especially like it seems like now there's a real uh, I don't know, there's a growth or preponderance of celebrities becoming possessed by archetypal powers, particularly kind of messiah and savior complexes.
Mm.
I'm really interested in this right now, and I've been noticing it in a few figures like Russell Brand, Jordan Peterson, Terrence Howard most recently. And you see them, and they're so full of charisma.
Mm.
People can't stop, they can't look away, and they're compelled by what they're saying, even if what they're saying, when investigated, doesn't make a whole lot of sense or doesn't have a lot of
Mm.
wisdom. But there's something about the way they show up with this kind of this energy and this glow. um, but what happens, and you watch this over time, is there'll always be a fall. There'll be like a physical breakdown, like what happened to Peterson a few years ago,
Mhm.
complete mental physical breakdown,
Right.
or there'll be some kind of breakthrough of the shadow. So it'll come out that they've been sleeping around or doing drugs on the
Mm.
side or whatever. So just again, speaking to the danger like that, archetypes don't give a damn about your little life. So beware. I mean, would you agree with that? Is that too strong to say?
No, no, I agree. And then I would imagine there's also the psychological, the individual psychological complexes would be wrapped up in that,
Well, I think they're gonna
narcissism and
attract certain archetypal
yes,
energies, right? Like they
that's
act like
yeah,
magnets.
right, right. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, we live in a very interesting time. Um, mm,
Hmm.
yeah.
What
Mm,
I don't know if it's too personal, but why did you?
mm.
Because you did have you were kind of feeding the Instagram beast, creating content for Instagram, and
For
then
a
it
little
seems like you
while.
did, yeah, and it seems like you
Yeah.
stopped. Can you share a little bit about your thought process? Because nearly everyone I talk to these days, especially people who are in the healing professions or
Mm.
otherwise entrepreneurial, are really wrestling with this, like the demands of those social media platforms to, like you said, be productive, always be creating new content. And I think of it
Yeah.
like you're just feeding the machine.
Right.
Is that part of your decision making?
Yeah. No, it's such a good question. And it's such a hard thing to sort of talk about in a satisfying way. Like I always feel a little awkward uh, with the way that I think about it. But I think the big thing for me was that um, I mean, really simply, Brian, like I just was noticing my physical embodied experience, like being on Instagram, and it felt bad. Um, Scrolling, realizing that people have been creating content and I'm not paying attention to it. I'm scrolling right by it. I'm not interested. Um, that felt terrible. I mean, it sounds really basic to say, but just simply on a feeling level and in my physical embodied experience, it didn't feel good. And I thought, well,
Mhm.
if I'm feeling this way, other people are feeling this way. And while there might be a little bit of value in whatever I was offering because it wasn't to sell anything or, like it was really
Mhm.
just a kind of creative offering of some kind. I thought, I wonder even the kind of presence of mind people feel to take it in any way that might even be nourishing. And I just thought, I don't, it's just, I don't think it just doesn't work. It doesn't work for me.
Mhm.
Um, and I decided that people would find me in more organic ways as was
Hmm.
necessary. And I just have to trust that and not worry about it.
Hmm.
So I hope that
Yeah.
doesn't sound overly simplistic, because I do realize that there are lots of people whose livelihoods social media is a very important way in which
Hmm.
they are out in the world. But it's a big dilemma because everyone I talk to too, they don't like it, and yet they feel they have to do it. And I just wonder,
Hmm.
I have no idea what the resolution is, but it feels like something must
Hmm.
eventually emerge out of this
Something's got to
predicament.
give.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, you said it was like, you said like, well, I know that sounds like a kind of a basic explanation. To me, it sounds like a core kind of explanation. It was a inner knowing or feeling that this
yeah,
doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel true.
yeah.
It's not resonating at my core.
That's
And
right.
so I may not be able to articulate it in more with more sophistication or justification or anything. It just didn't feel right for me, and so I choose not to participate in something that doesn't feel like it's contributing to the good.
Yes,
I mean, that
yes.
sounds like the core speaking.
That's totally true. That's totally true. And as I was listening to you, I also recall the way in which when I was posting on Instagram, I was constantly thinking about, well, what should my next post be?
Hmm.
And it had this very up in the head feeling of like being pulled out of whatever I was doing there, that digital sphere, and that kind of dislocation of my awareness and presence, I found very disturbing.
Mm. And then, you're pointing to your head, like,
Yeah,
you're being taken up into your head, away from what you're doing. I've experienced that too. Like, I'm reading
mm,
something, a passage really grabs me. I go, oh, I'm going to share this on my Instagram. And all of a sudden,
totally.
I'm off in Instagram world and away
Yeah.
from just being immersed in whatever I was reading. So it's like the gesture of the core could be helpful in those moments, right? You take your hand,
Mm,
you put it on your heart or your solar plexus, and you go, what am I feeling here?
mm,
I
mm.
mean, yeah, I was going to ask you like how to kind of like practical tips for embodying the Corey, but I think we've touched on it throughout the conversation.
Yeah,
I think a
yeah,
lot of it has listening and trusting the kind of the inner need or desire that's being felt through your
yes.
system.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah. And staying close to that in the midst of our busy relational, social work lives. How am I in touch with my core self in the midst of being at work? How is the one that really informs the other? How am I in touch with this, the reality of who I am, as I'm, relating to my partner or my
Like
parent?
let me not lose that when I start to engage
Exactly.
with the outer world. Yeah.
Exactly.
The Corey is feeling a lot to me like the yogi. Like
Mm,
yoga to me, like it became apparent to me after practicing for years that it was really all about um, energy conservation and consolidation, like
mm.
drawing
See,
the
those are
energy
very
back to the center.
And those would be the positive gifts of Saturn: conservation and
Mm.
consolidation. Yeah, beautiful. Oh, I like that. Those three figures kind of
Hmm.
dancing, different faces of these dimensions of nature.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, this has been great, and I
Yeah,
think we've landed on our time constraint. So Saturn is
yeah,
smiling upon us today.
totally. And for those of your listeners that are like, wait, what about the shoes? Get the book.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
read the
Yeah.
section on shoes in the book, and it'll be hopefully bring a kind of smile
Well,
and even a real deepening sense of the significance, what shoes really hold for us, psychically, energetically.
I was gonna say it helped me think a lot differently about shoes. Like if you're out there and you're thinking like your obsession with footwear and shopping for shoes is somehow superficial or not meaningful or just participating in capitalism or whatever, read Saffron's essay or chapter on shoes in the Core. I think will be really redeeming and empowering for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's been great. Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate your time, and
Yeah.
I like talking to you. You really helped me deepen my understanding of depth psychology, and then this figure of the core. It's been fantastic.
It's always such a pleasure, Brian. We have wonderful conversations. Thanks again for inviting me.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I'm looking forward to speaking to you again, and what you guys kind of going to capture your interest next.
Yeah, yeah,
Any
yeah.
hints, or
So,
can you give anything away, or what are you thinking about or writing about these days?
um, um, I'm writing a book on astrology, so
Hmm.
that's the next big endeavor. So slow
Okay,
and steady.
I'm just going to throw this out. I've talked to my wife Debbie about it. It's like I need, as a non-astrologer, but as a
Yeah.
depth psychologist who's interested in astrology as a system, an archetypal system, right? Um, I would love a book that spoke to that, which was like kind of a primer, but from an archetypal or depth psychological perspective. Like, what's
Yes.
the significance of the houses and how
Uh-huh.
do the signs and the houses relate? But from that particular like Hillmanian, imaginal, archetypal perspective, I would find that so
Yeah.
valuable.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there is a work that really fits that exactly as you describe it. And I mean, I think that that's part of I hope to make a contribution in that direction, and there are others. But I would say that Liz Green, the Jungian analyst and kind of high priestess of depth psychological astrology, her book Relating, I think,
Mhm.
is really um, excellent in this way, like talking about the how does astrology and like the unconscious and the psyche, how do we understand that the planets, the sign, I mean, so she really unpacks all of that in a very crisp, clear way based on depth psychological principles and Jung's understanding.
Mhm.
And then the other is, of course, and this goes in a different direction, and that's Rick Tarnas's Cosmos and Psyche, where he's more laying out this whole cosmological paradigm and synchronicity, but it speaks to that in an equally important but somewhat different way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had Rick on the podcast recently, and
Yeah.
Cosmos and Psyche, man, that's no primer. I mean, that is it's huge in
Yeah.
scope and wow.
It's
Yeah.
true, but the first two chapters are really,
Yeah. Yeah.
but yeah, okay, but fair enough, not necessarily primer territory.
But
But I do
still,
think, yeah.
this wasn't so much a request for your recommendation because I've looked and I haven't quite found something because, even like Liz Green, she's a Jungian. And I'm like, I like where people went like post-Jungianism, like
Hmm.
Hillman kind of taking apart the contrasexual anima
Right,
animus and, kind
right,
of dealing with some of that kind of heteronormativity
right.
and old school European thinking about primitivism and all that stuff. I like, where we've come in those
Yes,
years since. And so I'm looking for something new that has some of that in it.
yes,
So
I
it's,
hear
I'm
you.
putting it to
Yeah,
you. You would be a good one
I'm
to
on
write
it.
it.
Brian, I am on it. So you just stay close and I am working on it.
All right. Well, thanks. We'll be waiting for it. Not to hold you to anything, but a
Mm,
friendly request, let's say.
oh, I hear you. Yes, my
All right. I'll let you go.
yeah.
Thanks so much. I appreciate
Thanks,
you.
Brian.
We'll
Yeah, me
talk
too. I
again.
appreciate it. Okay.